which are actually experiencing positive economic growth. The rest of the world is caught in a very deep recession. So actually the opportunities for intervening in terms of improving environmental management practices are much greater currently in the developing world, because those are economies which are currently actually going through quite significant growth processes. So there's a much greater opportunity to actually push the green economy agenda there. I think the issue of making sure that any interventions, any changes are equitable, fair in terms of meeting the interests of the most disadvantaged groups in society is absolutely critical. I think the risk of some of these agendas not necessarily taking into account the distributional consequences is something we need to be quite careful about. I mean, one area, for instance, is promoting market-based opportunities in order to promote environmental sustainability. Those who are best placed to take advantage of the market often tend to be those who are already connected to the market, and therefore not the most disadvantaged groups in society. And often creating value through nature actually enhances the benefits that flow to those groups in society and doesn't necessarily penetrate down to the poorest. We've got to be really careful about that. I worry, for instance, about initiatives, large initiatives like the Red Plus initiative, where large amounts of money will be transferred to societies, to developing countries, and when large amounts of money have historically been transferred to any economy, any system, it's the most powerful who try and benefit from those sums. So those sorts of initiatives might not actually reach the very poor, and by doing so might actually reinforce inequality or actually enhance inequality. So we've got to be careful, and we've got to think about ways in which these initiatives are actually made to work to the advantage of the poor. We need to think about access. I think fundamentally it's really important to consider how our political systems currently shape access to resources. While there is a problem to do with aggregate resource availability, the distribution of resources is actually heavily skewed in the current world. It's exemplified by a number of the protests that we see around us. The whole notion of the 1% has been contextualized at the moment mainly to do with those who benefit from the financial system. But actually, if we thought about the ecological system, I think you'd have a similar 1% who occupy a disproportionate amount of ecological space. So actually the governance question is intimately tied in to a distributional question of guaranteeing access to those who actually are closest to nature in many cases, but are systematically excluded from control and access. So they don't have a long-term stake, they don't have a long-term interest in maintaining the viability of the resources. And those who do have access are ones who often don't have the long-term stake. I think the solution to these challenges is actually understanding the circulation of power and the resources that exist within any particular system. I think inevitably when you intervene, you're intervening in a system which is already existing in terms of certain structures of inequality and power. And we have to understand that and understand how an intervention might then get circumvented or taken over by those who are powerful. And we've got to find ways in which we can actually reach below those structures to actually access those who might be more disadvantaged, have less voice in the system. So it actually requires a much deeper understanding of the political economy. There are always winners and losers. We've got to try and make sure that the winners are those groups in society who are most deserving of the interventions working in their advantage, the weakest sections, the poorest sections. There's a lot of evidence that communal management does actually create the kinds of incentive structures that allow local communities to take a long-term interest in the future of their resources. And with the adequate types of support, it doesn't always work purely in isolation. It often requires cooperation, collaboration, participation in the context of lots of other actors getting involved. It can actually help communities to take control of those resources and manage them sustainably into the future. And the kinds of support I'm thinking about, sometimes communal management might involve actually using the resource in some form of enterprise activity. And it's certainly interesting to think about community managed nature resources which are being used through the market. I mean, you can actually use the market to actually sell products which are derived from nature, to provide access to recreational opportunities, but those are also controlled at the community level. But in order to actually engage with the market on an equal footing, communities often need a lot of help and support. So one shouldn't expect them to be able to do it all on their own, but actually reinforce the kinds of initiatives that I've done, for instance, has been in the context of Indian forests. And an exclusionary paradigm defined Indian forestry for well over a century, where local communities that lived in and around the forest weren't necessarily the primary beneficiaries of forest management. Forest management practices were oriented towards state-run forestry establishments, which were often managing the forests for external users, typically extractive industries, which were actually reliant on those forests for their own inputs. So that kind of paradigm is a classic example where the immediate surrounding communities don't have any stake in the long-term health of the resource which they live in and around, and as a result are forced into degrading kinds of practices. They don't have a long-term stake, so they don't really care about the long-term sustainability of the resource. So that's a classic example of where actually access and distributional questions shape people's incentive structures and attitudes. And unless we can actually reform the governance structures, as has been attempted in the context of forests in many parts of the world, moves towards much more participatory forestry, but also more radically in the Indian context, trying to secure rights over forests through important legislative interventions, are ways in which actually trying to secure that relationship between people who live in and around a resource and therefore can have a long-term stake in managing it.